Morning. Happy summer, everybody. And thank you, Jonathan, for leading us in worship today. Back in the day, Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Life is like a parachute jump. You've got to get it right the first time." So I want to ask you a few questions. What do you want to be remembered for? When your time on earth is finished, why will people miss you? If your memorial service was going to be next weekend, what do you think people would say about you? Today we are concluding our series on epic Old Testament heroes of the faith. I want to end by talking about epic legacy, leaving an epic legacy. And the Old Testament character to highlight is Moses. Now, you might be wondering, why Moses? Well, after successfully leading the Israelites out of Egypt, God did not permit him to enter the promised land because of his sin. In other words, Moses did a lot of good things, but he also made some mistakes that cost him, and that reminds me of yours truly. See, the fact is, though, and this is good news, you don't have to live a perfect life to leave an epic legacy. You and I will make mistakes along the way, and there'll be times in your story when you could go back and wish that you could rewrite a chapter or two or three. Well, the good news is you can't do that, but you can still start and write a great finish today. And so Moses is a good case study because he answered some of life's most important questions the answer to which lead to the development of our legacy. So I want to, this is like a snapshot of Moses' life story because he's all through the Old Testament, especially the book of Exodus. The Israelites have been living in the land of Egypt for 430 years. Now, a young man named Joseph had ended up in Egypt after being sold into slavery by his brothers to a band of traveling merchants. Joseph honored God and rose to a position of great power, prime minister, second to only Pharaoh himself. But eventually, there was a Pharaoh that arose in Egypt that did not know who Joseph was. And after Joseph died, the Pharaoh that no longer remembered Joseph was concerned that the Israelites were growing in numbers and would eventually outnumber the Egyptians. So the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1, verse 16, "When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth, if they give birth to a boy, kill him. Throw them into the Nile River." Now, however, the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. And I think that is a good example of obeying authority until that authority goes against God's authority. Moses' mother hid him for 3 months, and then when she couldn't hide him any longer, she put him in a basket among the reeds in the river. And sure enough, along comes Pharaoh's daughter to bathe in the river and finds the baby. Little Moses is crying. She felt sorry for him and snatched him up and took him home. And all the while, Moses' older sister Miriam is watching, and she comes to Pharaoh's daughter and says, "Do you want me to get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter says, "Yeah, that's a great idea." And so Moses' sister went back and got their mom and brought her back. And I think that's awesome how God works behind the scenes. Pharaoh's daughter says, "Please, nurse this baby for me, and I'll pay you to do that." So Moses' mom took him, nursed Moses, and she got paid for doing it. And so and then when Moses grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, meaning I drew him out of the water. Now fast forward. Moses is now 40 years old. He sees how his people are being mistreated by Pharaoh. He sees an Egyptian beating one of his Hebrew brothers, and looking this way and that, he sees no one, and he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. And the next day, Moses sees two Hebrews fighting each other and goes to them and asks, "What's the matter with you? Why are you fighting each other?" And they responded, "Well, who made you king of the pyramids? Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian?" Well, Moses knows now that his cover is blown, the word is out on what he did. It's just a matter of time before Pharaoh is after him. So he hightails it out of Dodge and heads for Midian. He ends up getting married and actually spends the next 40 years in the desert tending sheep. 40 years. And so the king of Egypt eventually dies, but things continue to go badly for the Hebrews. So one day God comes to Moses in the great burning bush story. He sees this bush on fire but not being consumed, and so he goes over to take a closer look, and that's what God speaks. Exodus 3, verse 5. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And then verse 10, Exodus 3. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And so Moses asked in verse 13, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, well, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. So then Moses offers up all these excuses why he isn't the guy for the job. And so God says, well, Moses, what's in your hand? You have a staff, throw it on the ground, and it became a snake. Now take it by the tail, and it became a staff again. Now Moses, put your hand inside your cloak, and when he took it out, his hand had leprosy, as white as snow. Now put your hand back inside your cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored. So God walks him through all these things that he has the technology and the power to do. And so eventually God wins the argument by doing that. So God sends Moses to Pharaoh. By this time, Moses is 80 years old. Can you imagine? 80 years old. And so the 10 plagues, with the 10 plagues on the land of Egypt, Nile into blood, there's frogs, gnats, flies, livestock died, boils, hail, locusts, total darkness, death of the firstborn, the Passover. And so eventually Pharaoh relented, and so let the Israelites go. And then so God led them through the desert to the Red Sea. And then the Pharaoh has second thoughts. He's sorry he let them go, so he went after them. And then the greatest miracle in the Old Testament, Moses stretched out his hand, holding the rod out across the water, and it parted. And the Israelites walked across on dry ground, and as the Egyptians came to pursue them, the waters closed up and drowned the Egyptian army. And then after 11 months in the region of Mount Sinai, the Israelites set out for the promised land. Along the way, they were complaining about having to eat manna every day and reminiscing about the good old days back in Egypt. And so all their complaining angered God and frustrated Moses. And when they got to a place called Kadesh Barnea, along the southernmost part of the promised land, God directed them to send spies into the land to check it out. And the spies came back and said, it's a great place, all right, but there's no way we can go in there. The people are too big and will devour us. We feel like grasshoppers compared to them. All but two, Joshua and Caleb, said that it's impossible. We just should go back to Egypt. And, this had the effect of really making God upset, more than disappointed. He said, how long will these people treat me with contempt? I will strike them down. But then Moses interceded for them on behalf, and God had mercy on them, but said, you will wander in the desert for 40 more years, and every one of you, 20 years and older, will die in the desert, except Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who said it could be done. And so it was during these 40 years that God gave the Israelites instructions to make the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant. It was during these 40 years that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So the Israelites spent 40 years on a journey that should have lasted about 12 days. But it wasn't distance that stood between them and the promised land. It was the condition of their hearts. After fighting long battles and wandering in the desert for 40 years, just before he died, Moses addressed the Israelites one last time and warned them not to fall away from God. This is what he said in Deuteronomy 34, verse 4. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you'll not cross over into it. And then Deuteronomy 34, verse 5. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. And historians speculate, they've pinpointed Moses' death either the year 1406 or the year 1405 BC. They can put it pretty close to one of those years. But consider the legacy of Moses. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. He led the Israelites, more than 2 million of them, out of Egypt. He received the 10 Commandments from God. He is mentioned all throughout the Old and New Testament. In fact, his death is not his last appearance. In the New Testament, on the Mount of Transfiguration, he appears with Jesus and Elijah to Peter, James, and John. And this is what Hebrews 11, verse 23 through 27 says about Moses. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because he saw he was no ordinary child. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he's looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. And I think the reason why we remember Moses for all these great moments in history is because he settled the basic questions of life. And these all have to do with leaving a legacy that lasts. This passage in Hebrews 11 not only gives us the great summary of Moses' life, but it gives us the principles by which we also can leave a lasting legacy. So 4 principles for leaving a legacy. And the first one is this. It is be yourself. Now, I think a better way of stating it would be the person God created you to be. Not the person someone else wants you to be, not even the person you wish you were, but the person God created you to be. And so this answers the question, who am I? It's the question of identity. I've heard it said that the 2 most important days of your life are the day you're born and the day you figure out why. Moses had to deal with this issue early on in life. Remember, Moses' mother hid him for 3 months after he was born, but when she could hide him no longer, she put him in a basket and placed him in the river. Moses, Pharaoh's daughter was bathing down by the river, saw the basket, found the baby, felt sorry for him, took him in, raised him as her own son. You could say that Moses went from being a basket case to being a son of Pharaoh's daughter. And so, but from the very beginning, can you imagine the identity issue that Moses faced? He was born Jewish, but raised Egyptian. Talk about 2 different cultures. And at some point in his life, he had to decide, who am I? Now, this is not a simple choice because it was going to set the course for the rest of his life. If he said, I'm an Egyptian, he'd have life made in the shade, living on Easy Street. He could have lived in a gated community on Egyptian way. He would have possessions out of his ears. He'd be Mr. Popularity, have every pleasure imaginable, and nearly unlimited power. But if he said, I'm Jewish, he would be humiliated, kicked out of the palace, sent to live with Jewish slaves the rest of his life. But see, there was the problem, and the problem was this. Moses saw his own people being horribly mistreated, and he could not remain silent. And so this is the decision he made. Hebrews 11, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That word refused means to reject, to deny, to disown or renounce. See, Moses totally cut himself off from all the benefits to being a son of Pharaoh's daughter and refused to live a lie in order to be who God called him to be. After I graduated from high school, I was all set to go to the University of California at San Diego in their pre-med program. Got accepted, and because I wanted to be a doctor. And by the way, where UC San Diego is, it's the community of La Jolla, just north of San Diego, and it also has some really epic waves and surfing. Not that played a role, and I had a great job that summer after high school. I was at a cannery and working at a cannery in San Jose, but it was union wages. But then peach season ended historically early. And it was just in time for me to go to summer camp at Heavenly Hills Christian Camp. And I was the only student from my youth group to go. But at camp, I realized that if I became a doctor, I would treat patients, but in the end, they would still die because we're all terminal. But if I went into pastoral ministry, I could impact people for eternity. And I wanted my life to count. So I made the choice to enter the ministry. It was a last-minute choice. And so instead of catching waves in Southern California and studying pre-med, I went to San Jose Bible College. And my life took an entirely different path. And since then, I can't say it's been all unicorns and rainbows ever since then. There have been a couple times I've tried to get out of pastoral ministry. But God has not been particularly cooperative on that front. And I've had, and along the way, I've had some really interesting jobs in the workforce because typically I also like to be involved in the community. So I've been an ambulance driver, a drug and alcohol rehabilitation chaplain, a whitewater raft guide, a hospice chaplain, a truck driver, a school bus driver. But invariably, at every single one of those jobs, I end up being called Pastor Greg. Now, obviously, not all of us are called into pastoral ministry. But see, the question of identity has to do more with who you're living for than it does with what you actually do. When talking about a legacy, this question of identity is one we all have to ask. Am I going to live for God, or am I going to live for the values of this world? And when you die, will anything be said about your faith and how you live for God? Or is it only going to be about your earthly accomplishments? Several years ago, Caleb Justice was a young man. He was 15 years old from Vancouver, Washington, and he drowned while on a church outing. But see, it's an unspeakable tragedy, but even at a young age, Caleb possessed great faith and love for God. And even the Oregonian said, since Caleb's death, other teenagers have taken what they call the Caleb vow, which calls for them to love others fully no matter what, just like they said Caleb did. And Caleb's dad said, as a parent, you can't be more proud than that. That's a legacy, not trophies or being the best in the baseball team or whatever. Those fade. But it's those memories and those people coming back and saying, he made a difference in my life. I'm going to be a different person now because of him. That is a legacy. So, second principle for leaving a legacy that lasts is this: accept responsibility for your own life. And this answers the question, who is in charge of my life? Hebrews 11:25. He, referring to Moses, chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. And so this settles the issue of choice and personal accountability. And I know that God is the one ultimately in charge of my life, and he alone gives me life. He alone knows the number of my days, and he alone directs my steps. One of my all-time favorite verses is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. That says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. But in all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your paths straight. But make no mistake about it, you and I are still responsible for the choices we make. God has given us great freedom to choose, and with that freedom comes great responsibility. And Moses chose the will of God. And see, there's so many incidents and people that Moses could have blamed for his life situation, but he didn't. He accepted personal responsibility for his life. And I think for a number of reasons, it seems as though our culture is bent on conditioning people to see themselves as victims. I think there's some economics behind that, but that is not what being emotionally healthy looks like. Stop blaming others for your life. Don't say it's not my fault. Do something about it. I heard about one little boy who was allowed to sit in his father's place at the dinner table one evening when his father was out of town. His sister was slightly older, and she resented the arrangement. So she said, okay, you're the father tonight. How much is 8 by 6? And without a moment's hesitation, he responded, I'm busy, ask your mother. Accept responsibility for your own life. And people who do that tend to live effective lives. And more importantly, when they die, they leave a positive legacy. It's interesting that in verse 23, as a baby, God chose Moses. And then in verse 25, when Moses grew up, he had to choose God. Works both ways. So here's a $64,000 question. God has chosen you, but have you chosen God? Are you living for him? Are you taking him seriously? Some of you should consider making that choice. Notice back in verse 24 when Moses made his choice, when he had grown up. See, one of the marks of maturity in life is when you learn to accept responsibility for your own decisions. See, here's the truth. Nobody can mess up your life but you. Satan can't. He doesn't have enough power. God won't. He loves you too much. You're the only one who can mess up your life. Now, you can't always determine what's going to happen to you, but you can always choose how you respond to that. That's the choice that you have. Be yourself, accept responsibility for your life, and then number 3, determine your values. And this answers the question, what really matters to me? See, every person at some point in life has to answer the question, what's really most important to me? What really matters in life? And that's not something that you just decide haphazardly or flippantly. It's something that you give serious thought and consideration to. And the reason Moses left a legacy that lasts is because he clarified his values. Check out Hebrews 11, verse 26. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Now, regarded means to weigh in the balance, to consider the options, to evaluate the worth. Moses considered God's purposes of greater value than all the treasures, luxuries, and comforts Egypt had to offer. And I think it's interesting that it was true for Moses, and it's true for us today. This is what seems to matter to a lot of people in our world today. Power. In other words, I'll do whatever I have to get to the top. Pleasure. If it feels good, do it. And possessions. The one who has the most toys wins. And I think a lot of the world is frantically attempting to achieve those things. Why? Because it's what they value. See, by the world's standards, Moses had it made because he already had all those things. And yet, he walked away from it all to live with a bunch of slaves and be true to his identity. What kind of person would do that? Well, somebody with a different kind of value system. Now, if these were not the important things to Moses, what were? This is important because if Moses had not made the decisions, we wouldn't be learning from him today. None of that would have happened in history that he was a part of. He would not have left the legacy he left. He'd just be a forgotten mummy in a tomb somewhere in Egypt. So this is what mattered most to Moses. First of all, God's purpose was more valuable than power. In verse 24, he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, do you think that was a status symbol? Moses is the big man at the pyramids. He had all the status, popularity, position, power that most people would say, I'd give my right arm for that. But Moses said, I'd rather be a slave fulfilling God's purpose than be the king of Egypt, not fulfilling God's purpose. Well, secondly, for Moses, God's people are more valuable than pleasures. That was another conscious value that he chose to adopt. Verse 25, Moses chose to be mistreated along with the people of God. And see, the people of God at that time were slaves in Egypt. Moses chose pain over pleasure. Why? Because he knew that people are more valuable than pleasure. And then thirdly, God's peace is more valuable than possessions. That's a third value that he chose. Now, have you discovered that there's some things in life that are so valuable and so important that they cannot be bought? One of those things is peace of mind. The peace of mind I'm talking about is giving yourself to that which matters to God. Because God is bigger than you are. And that's going to make a difference long after you're dead and gone. See, you cannot purchase lasting happiness. Now, you might be able to buy temporary happiness for a bit, but pretty soon it ends up on the shelf with all the other junk that you've accumulated to be sold at a garage sale or on Craigslist. See, Moses was looking at the big picture, the legacy he would leave, and that was going to be way down the road at the end of his life on earth and his new life in heaven. And he valued God's peace more than possessions. See, the problem with many people's value system today is they have so much to live on and too little to live for. That's why Jesus said, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Moses said that God's peace is of more value than possessions. Why? Verse 26 gives the answer. Because he is looking ahead to his reward. That looking ahead means he's continuously looking. He was living in light of eternity. And when you do that, you can't help but leave a valuable legacy. Moses had a greater perspective than just the here and now. It wasn't about immediate gratification. Here's what Moses knew. Happiness is determined by your character. Character is determined by your choices. Choices are determined by your values, and values are determined by your vision. So, do you want to be a person who leaves a legacy that lasts? Then give serious consideration to those things, your character, your choices, your values, and your vision. And so this leads us to the last principle, which is don't take your eyes off the goal. And this answers the question, how committed am I to finishing well? Hebrews 11, verse 27, he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. See, Moses never took his eyes off the goal of heaven. He never took his eyes off God. And the key word here in Moses' life is verse 27, he persevered. Moses had to put up with 2 million whining, complaining Jews. And through it all, he persevered. Now, why choose Moses when talking about legacy? Well, let me close with the closing words about his life and let them speak for themselves. Deuteronomy 34, verses 9 through 12. Now Joseph, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid hands on him. And so the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. And see, like Moses, you and I are going to face enormous challenges in life and in the writing of our own story. And some of those challenges will rock your world and may not play exactly as you had anticipated or as you'd like. Life doesn't turn out the way that you planned for. But when that happens, I would encourage you to keep the perspective that Moses had. And I think it's the same perspective that the Apostle Paul had and all the others that are listed in Hebrews 11, the chapter of faith. Here's the way the Apostle Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 17 and 18. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And I love the contrast in that verse. Our troubles are light and momentary. But compared to a glory, which is not momentary, it's eternal, and it's heavy, it's weighty. And that's why because it lasts, that's why we fix our eyes on that. And I want to show a clip from a movie. It's a big aspirations and big dreams about writing an opus and a musical that would cement his legacy. But life interfered, and he never got a chance to do that. And he never left the high school. He never made it to Broadway or anything like that. But I'd like to take a look at the closing scene, because I think this illustrates what a legacy looks like.
Hello. Our master of ceremonies seems to be a little late, so I guess it's up to me to begin. When word first got out that the music program was cut and about the retirement of my husband, well, I've never seen such a response from the community. Oh, looks like my watch is fast. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present our governor and Kennedy High School alumnus, the Most Honorable Gertrude Lang.
been a long time.
My apologies for my tardiness, and Principal Walters, I'd like you to know, yes, I brought a note from my mother. Mr. Holland had a profound influence on my life, on a lot of lives, I know. And yet I get the feeling that he considers a great part of his own life misspent. Rumor had it he was always working on this symphony of his, and this was going to make him famous, rich, probably both. But Mr. Holland isn't rich, and he isn't famous, at least not outside of our little town. So it might be easy for him to think himself a failure. And he would be wrong, because I think he's achieved a success far beyond riches and fame. Look around you. There is not a life in this room that you have not touched. And each one of us is a better person because of you. We are your symphony, Mr. Holland. We are the melodies and the notes of your opus. And we are the music of your life.
What would a firefighter do?
Listen up, you penny pincher.
Oh, now there you go. But the principle is this. So, like, people talk about, they'll live in our hearts forever. I've heard that at countless memorial services. But the reality is, how long will people remember me after I'm gone? Well, my grandchildren, and that's about it. But if you're talking about leaving a legacy that's here on earth, that doesn't last. The legacy that lasts is the one in heaven. That's where we impact people forever. And that's what makes our lives worth living in the here and now. And so do not underestimate your impact on other people when it comes for eternity. Because that's what the gospel is all about. It's about relationship, loving God and loving other people, loving them into the kingdom of God, which lasts forever. Relationships are going to last forever in heaven, and that's what we have to look forward to. That is a legacy worth leaving. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your goodness and your grace, and I pray that you, as we persevere in life, I pray that you would use us and let us see the privilege of you working in people's lives. And I pray that you would use us as well. So let's focus on loving you and loving others as we see you working in their lives. We give you this day. In Jesus' name, amen.